Contrarian trade conversations ahead of the FFPC trade deadline. That's what we're going to talk about today on RotoViz OT. My name is Colm Kelly. I'm joined as always by Shawn Siegele. If you are signing up over at RotoViz and want to get access to all the content, all the tools, Shawn's work, Blair's work, the rest of the team's work over there, you're able to get that. But you can also get yourself a 10% discount if you use the code RVRadio2025 at checkout. That gives you access to all of the content and the tools. Shawn, trade deadlines across not just the FFPC, but many dynasty formats and many redraft formats that allow trading will be coming up this couple of weeks, depending on which format you're playing. And FFPC is just prior to NFL Week 12 kickoff. So we will be factoring in one of our teams to give us a little bit of a baseline or a background as to set up the conversation. We may dive in then to some other players or some other elements of the tactics that may come in ahead of the trade deadline. Now, these really are going to be things that we would factor into whether it was, week 4, week 5, but also now you have a clearer picture at this point of where the team is going, the direction of travel for success in 2025, and also where the trade deadline spurs the action that you have to make it now rather than wait and see how it plays out. So it's always a pretty exciting time. It can be tough sometimes to get the deals done, but people may have a team that has fallen out of contention that have been doing some deals over the last couple of weeks. But with the FFPC, one of the things that is a lot of fun is the teams that come in the top half go into the regular playoff structure. The teams that come in the bottom half go into a playoff for the 101 seed. So there is something really strong to play for either way at both sides of the table. The team that we talk about today, Shawn, is one that I think when you look at it and hear some of the names, you're probably like, I'm surprised that team is in that kind of bottom half of the pack, and it feels like could be in a real contendership for the 101 and winning that playoff bracket. When we get to that point in a couple of weeks, it feels like it's just going to miss out on getting into the regular playoffs. So we will dive in. I'll share that team, and then we'll dive into some. We're calling it Contrarian. We're going to have some talks here, Shawn. Shawn has been talking to me for a couple of weeks about trading JSN. We did get an offer probably about a month back now, and it involved getting Joe Burrow. And JSN's value certainly, Shawn, has only continued to climb over those weeks. But this is a team with Bo Nix, Jaden Daniels. It does have Marcus Mariota picked up with the injury to Daniels. It has Jalen Milroe as well. So it really is a 2-quarterback setup with Bo Nix and Jaden Daniels when he is healthy. Then it's Chase Brown, James Connors on injured reserve. We have Kenneth Walker, RJ Harvey, Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon on injured reserve, DJ Giddens, Rashard Smith, and Emmy DeMarcado. And then it's wide receiver wise, it's JSN. There's no surprise to anyone. Jerry Jeudy has to be included in all these rosters, so he's on this roster. He had a nicer performance coming out of the bye, so we'll see what happens moving forward. Jordan Addison, Troy Franklin, Pat Bryant, Christian Watson, Tank Dell on injured reserve, and Jalen Royals. So kind of a little bit more top heavy towards the wide receiver position. Then Brock Bowers and Harold Fanning at the tight end position. Shawn, very glowing and optimistic about Harold Fanning's rest of season outlook when he was recording Stealing Bananas with Ben Gretsch earlier this week. But it's an interesting team with, I think, a lot of talent. The one part people may be interested with, and this is the team that we drafted in the Listener League. That's why we do have some of those veteran running backs, Shawn, paired throughout this roster values last year that were just too good to pass up. But when we get into the controversial aspect of it, is not necessarily the team and the structure, but I think we should talk about the players that we would look to move, and maybe the listeners would have these players on rosters as well. Maybe if you're in a league where you have the back draw and you can go for the 101, or maybe you're in a league where it's just final start or finish position or points scored pairs out how the draft order is for 2026. But names like JSN, Brock Bowers, Jaden Daniels, I think that factoring the star names into conversations as to what maybe we could do with them, as well as some of the edge of roster players, is a fun way to target this conversation.
Yeah, so the first thing that we have to note here is, again, this idea of overconfidence and maintaining flexibility. We were able to win this league last year in its debut season, in part because of Jaden Daniels and Brock Bowers. Both of those guys miss a big chunk of the season with injury. That happens. And if you, especially maybe more early on in your league's history, and you're the champion, right? You're the defending champion, but your roster has not really separated from the pack in the way that some of your other championship teams probably have. Then you want to be especially careful about trading that future first. We did go ahead and trade a future first in this. In part, we did it for the fun. But it is going to be a situation now where this idea of winning the backdraw and getting the 101 no longer exists. Now, we still want to win and get the 201, which is one of the reasons that the people trading for your pick are like, this team, if they miss, is probably going to be in the mix, not just to get a pick, but to get the top pick. So when you're thinking about FFPC trading in general, you can be a little bit more reluctant to take the picks from teams that are good. But when those teams have some adversity and don't make the playoffs, then they're very well positioned to actually get the 101, as opposed to when you trade with the really weak teams and you're thinking, okay, well, this team is bad. It's the kind of team in most setups where you're actually going to be trading for the 101. Yes, that team may get a bye, but when they do that, they're going to still then lose in the next round. So they'll have the 103, the 104. Colm, one of the things that you have to do in FFPC Dynasty that I think actually pushes you in the correct direction overall with a rebuild is to try and get the pieces necessary to win the backdraw, as opposed to purely selling all of your veteran options. Now, it's tempting to think that as you head for the trade deadline and you have a veteran piece who may only be good for the rest of this season, and you have the teams that are competing for the title, that those teams are going to want to come out and give you this great deal. And I'm not saying that that never happens. You want to be open to that happening. But in many cases, the teams that are making the push for the playoffs, they're there because their team is good. Their need for those pieces now is actually less than it might have been during the offseason when they're trying to put together a roster that can make that overall push. So the incentive for them, unless they've just suffered a big injury, may actually be less. When you're talking about the teams that are in that like 4, 5, 6 position, those teams may be more reluctant to make a big trade because they're thinking, can we really compete with the number 1, the number 2 seed anyway? Do we want to sell out our future? And it can get to the point, where you do something like the reality Chiefs do, where you don't make an obvious move because you're thinking, well, what does that mean for my future? The team doesn't, again, feel the urgency to get that done. And then you have a bunch of teams kind of hanging on the fringes of those trade conversations saying, well, it doesn't look like you have the market for this player that you wanted, and that player is worthless to you. Why don't you give him to us almost for free? That's the trap that you never want to fall into. If you don't get the value for your trade, you want to sit on the player, even if there's a chance that their value continues to go down. We do get decent seasons, especially for guys who are already playing well, right? You get that strong second half from a veteran, 29-year-old, 30-year-old, 31-year-old player, sometimes for the tight ends, mid-30s players. You finish the season strong, you have that full year of numbers to point to, and then in the offseason, these guys are being drafted in round 4, round 5, round 6 of redraft, and the overall gravity then with that player is someone that you can trade to a dynasty manager who's trying to put together his or her roster for the next year. What this does for you is 2 things. You keep the player who is necessary to give you punch in the backdraw. You don't establish yourself as a manager who will give guys away. Once you start to establish that as your background at the trade deadline, you're going to find it very difficult to get good deals. You're going to get barraged with low ball offers. And this isn't to say that you never make trades or that you hold out for prices that are unrealistic. One of the things that we always try and discuss on OT is this idea of a win-win trade. But part of that is that you have to be one of the 2 winners, right? It can't just be the other guy. And you can run into this sort of nightmare situation of just getting so thin. I'm always nervous, even in situations where there is no backdraw, that the teams that are tearing themselves all the way down to the studs for the 101, that is not the fastest or most dynamic way to rebuild. You see your team as being so weak that you then make these moves that are so far looking that A, they're probably not optimized, and B, you actually run out of interest in the league before you can rebuild your team. You end up having to sell it or just get rid of the team. And then you kind of left your friends, your coworkers, whoever in the lurch because you weren't a good enough custodian of that dynasty team, that roster within that league. Colm, selling low on your veterans at the trade deadline is not the way to do it.
We have some veterans as well that we may get into later. The likes of a Chase Brown, whose season has been quite disappointing. You made the reference there for, if we're looking ahead to next offseason, was a second round pick this year. Probably will come down in terms of, depending on how the end of the season finishes out, where he'll be going next year. But, third, fourth round range is reasonable. And he's coming off, back-to-back games of 25 points and 19 points. So, again, we'll see after the bye week to get the Pittsburgh Steelers, again, trying to rehab or insulate some of that value ahead of the following season. But JSN, Shawn, we'll start with him because for me, he's almost in that category of, and I know we never really want to have completely untouchable. Maybe Brock Bowers will fit into this category for you, but they're both players who are tier one when it comes to your rankings, as is Jaden Daniels. But I think for this one, we'll focus on the non-quarterback elements to start it off. So for people listening, and that would mean Shawn would put them at a requirement of 3 first-round picks to part with them. Now, Shawn, if somebody comes to you with 3 first-round picks this week ahead of the trade deadline for either of those, no other players mixed in, obviously that could be 1 first-round pick and a different player. Is Shawn Siegele parting with those names, or are they on your not moving list unless it's a generational haul of picks? But you were willing to part with JSN a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one where those first-round picks are going to need to be picks that move the needle within that first-round conversation. Now, again, we have another season where there are so many reminders of why late first-round picks can be very valuable, why certainly any round 2 pick that ends up in the first half of round 2 can be very valuable. You have players like Brian Thomas, who's now fallen back off, but you think about Bo Nix and how valuable he is now, even coming off of one of the most depressing games of all time, how valuable he is as a guy who was a second round pick, that 202, 203, 204 area. You think about Jackson Dart, who Colm is probably simply the most valuable player from this year's class, who was going in that 111 to 112, but mostly like 202, 203 area this past season. So we can be overconfident in terms of where those first round picks come from. But one of the reasons that you want to have the early first round picks is you want to have the opportunity to grab the guy that you think is a generational talent and or to simultaneously move down. So if you have the early first round pick and you're really targeting a Jackson Dart or a Bo Nix, you could probably make multiple trades. Some of the trades that we did this past season, for example, moving down just a couple of spots and picking up a Tucker Kraft. Now, the sad part about that is just very bittersweet that he gets knocked out. But in order to move down a spot or two and give up picks that would turn into Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland, you get Tucker Kraft, who ends up probably being the same guy. Now, as we go forward, and especially with injury, especially with the lack of pass volume for the Packers, maybe that ends up not being very true, but it certainly had that potential before the injury. Right, you make as many of those types of moves. And so a move where you trade JSN for 3 picks that will probably be in the 106 to 104 type of range, so much you're able to do with that. But as we think about how you build the deepest roster and how you build the most flexibility, in order to get to a trade for a JSN, realistically, it's going to have to probably include players and picks. In the situation I think you'd be most likely to trade a JSN in would be one where you're going to move off of JSN because he is the best player in the NFL this year. He's the highest scoring wide receiver. He is if you put together an accurate ballot, he's probably the current MVP. There are other guys out there who in the future will have similar or greater value who are not carrying teams this year. And you think about our other dynasty team that is built around Justin Jefferson and how frustrating that has been. A Justin Jefferson or a Malik Neighbors, those are probably the names who are most likely trade matches for JSN. The tough part for people who want to acquire JSN is that because the current season is the most valuable and the one that people have the most visibility on and the most control over, and just even beyond that, we don't necessarily know that Malik Neighbors will come back and be what he was. We don't know that the Vikings will get this quarterback situation figured out, right? There are uncertainties even for guys like Jefferson and Neighbors when you look toward the future. To trade for JSN, I think that you need to put together a package that includes a Justin Jefferson or Malik Neighbors and probably a future first-round pick, which to include that pick on top of including a player who might simply be better than JSN straight up, a player that next year you might prefer, that's going to be tough, but that's the only fair way to get a deal done on a guy like JSN with the value that he has now. So as you're thinking through that portion of it, would you be comfortable selling JSN for that type of price? And is that the accurate price? And do you think the trade offers like that are going, I mean, in many cases, teams that have Malik Neighbors or have Justin Jefferson will not still be in the mix as a result of how one of their best guys is scoring. But for example, Monty and I have an RV Triflex team that is defending the title, is very good, has Malik Neighbors, has multiple future first round picks, again, because of this perpetual reloading idea. And for us, making a move where we gave up Malik Neighbors and gave up maybe other things in order to pick up the very best guys in fantasy right now, that would be possible for us. Whether or not it's the right move is a separate question.
The really challenging part about these names that I've taken up, and this is the reason I took them up to start with JSN, Brock Bowers, and you could factor Jaden Daniels into this, where they are players when we're talking about perpetually reloading, like Daniels is 25, the other two are 23. And it comes a situation where usually we're looking to, unless it's like just an extreme offer, you're looking to play those guys for the starting portion of their career, like JSN in year 3 here, and then you play him in year 4, and then he's at the peak of his kind of value, and you try and move him at that point to continue this perpetual reloading off your dynasty roster. With JSN and with Brock Bowers, because they are so early and so young in their career, it's very hard to, unless again it's just a really significant offer. You mentioned Justin Jefferson, but if you factor in the age difference and how you're going to try and manage that then for your roster moving forward, like, with a 26-year-old and Jefferson, you're giving up those 3 years, but then when you get to next season, you're into 27. You know yourself, and the listeners will know, once you start to get to 27 years old, trying to move some of those names in dynasty can get very, very tough. And the same as we talk about with running backs, the value starts to fall off pretty quickly if the season doesn't go the way people are expecting. So I think it's going to be very hard to either acquire those guys or get what I think would be significant enough to move. Like the offer we did get a few weeks ago with Joe Burrow involved was a fair offer, but I just thought that both the trajectory of JSN season, I even in the optimistic side of me wouldn't have put it to where it's gone to this point where Shawn Siegele is touting him as an MVP of the NFL. But I think that it's going to be very hard to move him unless it is probably a team where you're going to take on the Malik Neighbors injury plus additional pieces. You kind of need to get the tier 1 plus of players. And I also think that, as you kind of reference, it's going to be very limited situations where people are willing to give that up. The likes of CD Lamb, based on the age, CD Lamb, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, you're going to want to get that plus a little bit, I think, to get JSN, based just on not on the production, but on the way that you're going to be able to perpetually reload your roster and potentially move those players and those pieces. The same could be said for Puka Nacua with him in the 3rd year in the league, just that it does get much more difficult and the value does tear off quite considerably once you get to 27, 28, if the performances don't align with your projected values moving forward. So I think a way to change that is another roster we have, Shawn. We do have Justin Jefferson on that roster, and he also has some quarterback concerns and so on at the moment. We have Jordan Addison on this other team that we have. Again, he fits into a category of player who I think would be attainable, but a 23-year-old, where if maybe you were getting him and one of those pieces, or maybe even I think if you're like, it's going to be hard to get somebody to give him plus one of the tier 1 guys, but a potential tier 2 player, then you might start to consider moving a JSN at that point. But with Justin Jefferson, I think he really fits into that area of like perpetually loading and where the window is for moving some of these names. And Jamar Chase is having a much more successful season, but like we also will be starting to approach those times with him as well. With those guys, CD Lamb, the kind of older names, and I'm saying older, they're not older, but they're not rookies. Is that line for where you would look to potentially move them when we're looking at a perpetual reloading window? How are you feeling about those sort of names as we approach the trade deadline?
Yeah, and you've really hit on it where you get to this 26, 27-year-old age. That's where you want to sell. You want to play these guys from age 21 to 26 or 27. And at that point, fantasy managers can still see a long window of opportunity to get elite production. I mean, you think about where the Washington Commanders were with Terry McLaurin as a 30-year-old, and they're giving him a long-term contract extension, which unfortunately is already off to a terrible start because of the injuries. But it was such a necessary move in some ways for him. I mean, he understood and won that battle with the Commanders of your leverage at that point becomes so low. The Jamar Chase and CD Lamb situations are interesting because in some ways it's the Christian McCaffrey question all over again. With the wide receivers, you tend to have a much better late 20s window than with the running backs, both from a trade perspective and from an actual scoring perspective. But with someone like a Jamar Chase, it's basically a situation where you have to build the rest of your roster such that you can take Chase to 0. Now, if your team isn't good, then you do have to move it, and you have to work out with other managers what is the type of package that I can realistically move a Jamar Chase and get to the end of this with a team that is rebuilt and fully loaded for bear, to where now we're going to be the best team. You can't move him to some other team unless you get that type of package in return. When we talk about taking some of these guys to 0, I think back to the team that I have with Curtis Patrick, where we did a Pros versus Joe's dynasty team in the year before the RV Triflex format was created. This was a team that seemed perpetually snake bitten, where we had Saquon Barkley, we had Christian McCaffrey, we had Jamar Chase, we had other good players, and yet things are never breaking in the right way. Quarterbacks are getting injured. Some of those individual players, specifically, obviously, McCaffrey is getting injured. Saquon Barkley is not scoring. And you're thinking to yourself, we've got the best assets in all of fantasy, and yet things aren't working. But there just aren't that many trades out there, especially in a shallower format like the regular FFPC dynasty, where you can move those guys and ever put back together a starting lineup that is remotely similar. Finally, last season, you have it all sort of come together, right? Where you have the Barkley and Chase seasons together, you end up winning the title. And then this season, even with Barkley down, currently in the number 1 seed slot, because there just simply aren't that many ways to replicate a starting lineup that includes Chase and Barkley and Christian McCaffrey, and that team in addition has a James Cook. And so you have that additional elite scoring piece, and the other teams can't put together a lineup that works against you. So you have to understand how your starting lineup works and what you would need to do to build around it. One of the things that we do want to do with perpetual reloading is to build a deep enough team that we actually can take the absolute superstars into their twilight years, simply because moving them does not create a new starting lineup that is similar. Now, the caveat there would be if you end up with a bunch of very early first-round picks as a result, then you potentially can fill in with, Malik Neighbors or Brock Bowers or those guys coming back through the other side of it. But Colm, as we're thinking through it, how many teams are in the mix to move for a Jamar Chase and yet are going to be trading for him by giving you 3 or 4 picks that are in that 101 to 103 range?
Yeah, it's usually going to be teams at this point that are making that move that are going to be in the opposite range in terms of they're going to be at the back end of the draft hunting for a championship at this particular point. The only other way would be, if somebody took over a team and they're looking to, they had some first round picks, maybe they're trying to get themselves a foundation piece. But realistically, a lot of the teams that get taken over that are orphans are teams where the first round picks are no longer there. So those scenarios are kind of limited. But it is, I think, a good point for people when they're looking at their teams with Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb. I know I have CeeDee Lamb on quite a few rosters, but that age, I'm not saying age cliff in terms of he's going to completely fall off, but I mean in terms of where the apex of the dynasty value is. We look at somebody like Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I'm not going to say it's like for like, but you look at the career trajectory of a Cooper Kupp where he is truly at the peak. And, within basically 2 seasons now, we get Puka Nacua coming in, and that hurt him. But then obviously the injuries, the performance tailing off a little bit. You go back 3 seasons, he's in this tier 1 of wide receiver. But then you move forward very, very quickly, and that can fade out. And that can be environment related, could be just age related, could be performance related. But the players that slip out of this tier can happen very quickly. And that's where the perpetual reloading comes in terms of trying to continuously add talent to your team at that younger age group that's going to allow you then to not have to have those players. Now, Shawn mentioned taking players to 0. And for people that maybe haven't heard us talking about some of the stuff in the past, like a Christian McCaffrey, it's like you're not going to get the true value that he's worth to you this season by trading him. So holding him on those rosters and just accepting that you're going to get to a point where, he retires is the way to play it out. And with some of these talents in tier 1, that may be the way, because you may never get the true value of them. And as Shawn referenced earlier, holding those players rather than losing them for less than they are worth is the way to play it. It's interesting when we look, Shawn, at your rankings on the website, and seeing the one note that I would have between tier 1 and tier 2 is that players in tier 1 are obviously the elite of the elite, but there's basically no question mark, even with the Justin Jefferson and the QB kind of issues. Like when we look though into Q2, you get in, or tier 2, you get the likes of Nico Collins, Rashee Rice, Ted McMillan, Emeka Egbuka, Garrett Wilson, Travis Hunter. People will have different rankings and different orders of players, but there starts to become immediately a lot of question marks around. Like when I go back and look at the JSN question, would I take Ted McMillan and Emeka Egbuka for JSN? When we're trying to decide, what would you take a player plus something? Would you take Ted McMillan and Emeka Egbuka for JSN? And then I'll do the same question for Justin Jefferson.
Yeah, I think you would, or I think I would. And part of that is that you have so many different ways to win. And certainly with Egbuka, you have a player who's already in position to score in a big way right now.
And I'm going to even to push this further, will we do it with Travis Hunter instead of Egbuka?
No, I don't think that you would, although it would be interesting. But the thing with Hunter is similar to, in some ways, the issue with Malik Neighbors. And you talk about that injury to Cooper Kupp and what it meant for him and where his dynasty value went. You have to your teams are going to evolve, and you're going to have some of the absolute superstars that you ideally do take throughout their entire career. But one of the big pluses for perpetual reloading, beyond building the types of teams that I have with Bjorn, that I have with Monty, that I reference, where these teams have serious injuries, and yet they're still very much in the mix, if not co-favorites to win the title, is because of that overall depth. But beyond the overall depth that you build is you also have a lot of players where they're going to be able to hold their value even when the worst happens. So you think about Malik Neighbors and what happens to his value with that injury versus what happens to a 27, 28-year-old player when they suffer the same injury, right? So it's the same fate, and yet where you go forward from that is just so different.
They're
those
more
are the types of
insulated.
things that beyond scoring and even beyond the next 2 to 3 years of scoring matter to you when you're trying to create the most upside, the most paths, and the most insulation from risk.
Yeah, and the insulated factor there is that, like, see, with Jaden Daniels, it's very unfortunate that he's picking up these injuries, but if you start picking those up when you're 28, 29, and the quarterback position, obviously people are looking a little bit more long-term in terms of the apex of careers, but it does support them a little bit more. Shawn, the other one that I'm going to talk about here is Brock Bowers, because again, when we look at the tight ends and the elite tier of tight ends, there's a lot of players who are in that development stage where I think they could potentially get up there over the next couple of years. Trey McBride, Brock Bowers, again, they're going to be very hard unless you've built out rosters like, fortunately, in some leagues we have over the last couple of years where you've drafted these names. You may have both on the same roster. You may have Tyler Warren to go along with that, or a Sam Laporta. Any of the elite names that you'd be, if there's listeners out there and they're looking at perpetual reloading, keeping that window open, like Jonathan Taylor this season, I think you just have to, you mentioned the phrase taking him to zero earlier. Like in the off season, you may look to move a Jonathan Taylor. I don't think there's any way where teams that are contending now could possibly look to move it. We did look at one of our leagues where a team that we're up against this week is 0-9 and was a Jamar Gibbs roster with a number of other very talented names on it. But there's a possibility that a Jonathan Taylor team is out there that isn't competing. Any of these other elite names that you want to highlight as potential, give the devil's advocate for why you would move it, and more so to give the case for the perpetual reloading?
Yeah, the Bowers one is just so unique because he's just absolutely going to crush all of football over the next decade. It's almost impossible to put together a package where you would feel comfortable making that move. I referenced the team with Bjorn. It's really just a pretty crazy team where it has Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix. It has Bijan Robinson and Bucky Irving. It has JSN. It's got great receiver depth beyond that. It has Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, Tucker Kraft, and Harold Fannin. And so you're looking through that group, and now obviously Kraft is out. But when you have Bowers and McBride and Laporta, and you now have the Jaden Daniels injury, obviously you've missed Bucky Irving for most of the season. You're looking at that, and there is going to be some temptation to do something like move Bowers or McBride or Laporta. It's tough to get back the type of value that you would really want to make those moves, right? If you trade for someone like a Jonathan Taylor, it does increase your chances to win this year, but you're still hurting yourself so much over the long term. You're thinking, like, how can we just weather the storm? You pick up a Marcus Mariota by spending your whole budget. You are working through on a week-by-week basis that running back 2 position. And so it is an interesting question, right? Because this is a team that has 2 1s and 2 2s and 2 3s. So it's not limited in terms of making a trade deadline move to get even stronger. I mentioned the depth at the receiver position. So it's Rashee Rice, Zay Flowers, Jamison Williams. You're going to be able to put together an elite starting lineup already. So any move that you make where you move a Bowers, you're going to lose the scoring from that spot, but you're also a bit limited in terms of how much marginal value a new starter would have over the guys who are already on your roster. So my recommendation would be to try and build that type of roster and to keep those first-round picks that I referenced, keep the second-round picks that I referenced, and continue to fill back through for the next season with more stars, as opposed to make a push for this year, because the roster is already so good that we could still lose. There are 2 or 3 other teams in the league that are very, very good. Maybe you don't beat them this year, but you still might. You're not going to control it a ton by making a move, and you're going to be weaker for the future. So that would be how you would balance that. I think if you are in that situation and you want to move a Sam Laporta, you could potentially do it. Although Sam Laporta is one of these guys where it's a little bit tough to get the full value. Colm, when you're thinking about a Brock Bowers, if you had a Trey McBride on your team already and you needed running backs, I mean, this is the big running back week. Who would you feel comfortable moving Bowers for? Would you move him for a Jonathan Taylor? Would you move him for an Achane? It does get more... It gets more fun to think about it when you're like, what would I do with Brock Bowers and Jahmyr Gibbs straight up if I needed running back help? And
what I was going to say is, Shawn, the only running back that I would consider, starting a package with would be getting Gibbs. That would be where it would have to start. And it's basically like Taylor would come into that age conversation of like, how can you play him? Like, are you playing him this next basically 8 weeks and then trying to trade him in the off season? Achane, as great as things are, there's a lot of potential movement, we'll say, in Miami over the course of the off season. So we'll see what plays out there. It really kind of, for me, would have to be Gibbs being the starting point of that conversation. So then that sets you up with there's only one trade partner. You would need them to come to you, and then they're probably not wanting to give up Jahmyr Gibbs either to get Bowers. The reference would be just the power that position gives you versus the other positions, and being able to, in a lot of leagues, if you have a Trey McBride and a Brock Bowers, or even maybe where we're seeing Tyler Warren evolve at the position, there's just too much advantage to give up versus your league mates to move those. That's the other part with some of these, is you are also given that advantage to the rest of the league. I wouldn't be saying to just hoard all these tight ends, but you don't want to just give that over to another team that you're going to be competing with moving forward. So tight end at the elite, all these elite players, Shawn, the true thing is again, when we talk about the depth at positions, you can have depth on your team where you have some of these names, and then you mentioned the likes of like Jameson Williams or Rashee Rice that can be on the rest of your roster. But when you're looking at the actual elite players versus the other players that are going to be available on other rosters, it becomes a little bit challenging then to make some of these moves. So again, we just wanted to have a conversation around some of the players that I don't think people are going to be acquiring or moving this week, but just to have that conversation and a little bit different of a topic here as we exit week 10 and enter NFL week 11. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening along.
Colm, I did want to throw in one more quick contrarian note on the trades, which is that Monty and I were considering this move of, say, Luther Burden and a 3 to pick up Jordan Addison on a team that is very, very competitive. You want to get Addison. Addison's still 23, right? And so you move in a very positive direction there. I think where it becomes a little bit more interesting and trickier is this idea of, if you were in that same position, you had a loaded roster, and you actually divest yourself a bit of peak-ish resources, but guys who everyone's going to recognize as meaningful names, clear-cut fantasy starters, but they don't score at such a level that they're dramatically different than maybe some of your guys on the bench if you've built a good team. So if you've built a good team and you have good starters, but you also have good backups, would you actually weaken your starting lineup a little bit with a team that, again, is like in the 1, 2, 3 seeds type of situation, a team that is definitely competing for a championship? Are you willing to move a clear-cut starter to pick up, say, a Luther Burden or a Jaden Higgins along with some extra depth, right? Say a future second, a future third, whatever is appropriate to that trade. Say this is the moment where another team that is either trying to like get across and make the playoffs, or it's one of our head-to-head competitors who feels like if they can take this starter off of our roster and they can fill their last starting spot, and what they're giving up is still a wild card. You still don't really know about Luther Burden, even though he was back in the mix in week 10. You still don't really know about Jaden Higgins, even though he finally flashes in week 10 and is part of that comeback victory. Do you have the guts to do that type of move? That would be the other contrarian trade that I would recommend here as you move toward the trade deadline. Don't be afraid to do the real gunslinging move here of weakening your roster a tiny bit, but taking on that huge potential upside, creating more paths for yourself. Just because you're about to compete for and hopefully win the 2025 title doesn't mean you can't simultaneously be trying to figure out, how do I win in 26 and 2027 as well?
Awesome way to finish up there. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. Of course, you can find all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.